Scott. All right, Scott Monty, share your best advice and introduce yourself, my friend.
Hey, Phil, thanks for having me. I am Scott Monty from Timeless and Timely, and my best piece of advice that I've gotten is the world needs more writers. And I'll explain that to you in the show.
More writers. So who gave you that advice, Scott? Was that advice you gave, or when did you learn
No,
that?
this was advice that I received when I was all of 21 years old, I think. And it was not from a boss. It was not from a professor. It was not from anyone related to my career in any way. Um, some people know this about me. Some people don't. If you've just met me, I like Sherlock Holmes, like in an almost unhealthy way. Um, I'll bring these guys up to prove my point. um, a lot of Sherlock Holmes kind of stuff in the background here, as you can probably see. But I was in Boston for university. I went to BU. And there was a literary society up there called the Speckled Band of Boston, an august group that was founded in 1940 and meets annually for a dinner every spring. And in order to become a full-fledged member, you need to submit some sort of piece of scholarship, a paper, an essay, a poem, something showing that your interest is more than just casual. And I submitted, I don't know, maybe 5 papers within the span of the first month that I heard about these folks. And first of all, the recording secretary wrote me a note back saying, Scott, please stop. Your furor scribendi is breaking my Xerox machine. Okay, so that was one. So as a classics major, as someone who studied Latin, I knew I found my people. For anyone to use the phrase furor scribendi, which means writing furor, I thought that was pretty clever. Anyway, I went to the first meeting and I met kind of the social head there, the guy that made sure that everyone felt comfortable, and he kind of managed the whole executive committee. And he chastised the recording secretary who told me about the furor scribendi. He said, "Look, Scott is a writer, and the world needs more writers." And that was my good friend Dan Poznansky, who now lives up in Maine. And it took me many years to realize that piece of advice, it really wasn't advice, it was an observation, but to me it came back as advice, because to me leadership is all about communication, and communication in all of its forms has to do with writing. And whether you're preparing a piece of audio, a video, even taking a transcript from a live video, we do so much of what we do today in the written form. And in an era when we're tweeting and texting and even TikToking, it is refreshing to see people that understand the written word and know how to mold words and marshal them for causes and purposes that they care about.
Wow. I love that, man. That's so good that somebody didn't just say, "Hey, Scott, don't write." Right? You're a scribendi, I think is a fun way to go after that. But so interesting that they called you a writer back then. Did you believe that? I mean, was that something that stuck with you, Scott? I mean, you sort of said it's advice, but I mean, did it hold you back or did it propel you forward?
No, it actually, now that I think about it, has been a defining point at many times in my career. As I said, I was a classics major as an undergrad. Well, that meant a lot of essay writing. Well, obviously, it meant a lot of reading. And quite frankly, if you want to be a good writer, first you have to be a reader. And as you can tell behind me here in my library, I really appreciate the written, the printed word, obviously. And it's through reading different writers that we become conscious of our own writing style, that we develop our own style, that we appreciate certain styles. Yeah, it was pretty early on in my studies that I discovered that I preferred Hemingway over Faulkner, for example, in an American Lit course. Why? Well, because Faulkner wrote run-on sentences that went on for a page and a half without using punctuation. Hemingway used very clipped phrases. He actually wrote almost the way you would expect him to speak. And to me, if you're writing for an audience, whether it's a newsletter, whether it's web copy, you want people to feel your voice come through in all of it. And for me, understanding that in my writing was absolutely critical. So when I went on to do postgraduate studies, I actually wanted to go to medical school. So I started the first year and realized pretty quickly that science was not where my strengths were at. It actually is more in the humanities. Big surprise, right? So I decided to add an MBA along with the first year of medical school to get a master's in medical science and an MBA in healthcare administration. And while I was in the MBA office, somebody, one of the dean's assistants said, "Oh, we've got a job opportunity here, part-time job opportunity. The Department of Veterans Affairs, which is now being put up against all the major healthcare systems with the Clinton healthcare plan potentially being introduced. The Veterans Affairs Department needs writers to write up the new VA healthcare plan as this new government and private sector group is coming together to define what healthcare looks like in the 21st century." And I go, "I'm a writer. Dan says I'm a writer." So I raised my hand and became part of the task force on the Veterans Affairs healthcare plan, which was a fascinating career development. And it, eventually led me on to managed care and pharma and biotech consulting and on to big tech and social media.
Wow. That's cool. I did not realize that. That's quite a journey there, Scott. And as a veteran, thank you for helping veterans get the word out.
Thank you for your service, my friend.
Absolutely. So let's back up a little bit here, Scott. You said writing should sound like you speak. So would you say that you developed your speaking voice first, or your writing voice first, or did they develop at the same time?
That's a good question. I want to say I developed my speaking voice first, but I think you look at so many different types of words on the printed page, and look, it's very, very easy to get into slang and street speak and the rest because it's easy, right? I mean, humans are lazy. For me to construct a sentence as I'm speaking with you, and for that sentence to come out grammatically correct in your transcript is a thing of beauty, period, or comma. If I can think of a phrase that doesn't require me to end the sentence with a preposition while I'm speaking to you, hey, I might sound like I'm halfway educated, but is it necessary? No. Right. So to me, there are different ways to write depending on the voice you're trying to put together. And frankly, as I've had a number of podcasts and a few scripted podcasts, I've realized that writing for the ear and writing for the eye are two different things, right? You need to understand your audience and where they're coming from. And so when I offered a spoken word version of my newsletter, I would actually have to speak it slightly differently than I wrote it because I didn't want to sound like Faulkner in a podcast. Right. So it's really about knowing yourself and knowing your audience and knowing what kind of medium you're inhabiting at the time.
Interesting. So let's talk about that creative process, and then let's talk about curation after that, because I think that's interesting that you point out that the written word and the spoken word often aren't the same. I mean, I heard when Gary Vee did Crush It, for instance, he performed the book very differently than the book was written. So I think that's interesting. So can you give me some examples how that showed up for you, Scott, as you've gone through the creative process?
Well, I think one of the ways I thought about it is a couple of, let's say, old radio examples that come through. The one that sticks with me still to this day, and this is a relic, there may not be a lot of people left who remember this guy, is Paul Harvey. Every day, Paul Harvey used to do 15 minutes of news and commentary. And then he'd do, well, I think in the morning he did a 5-minute version of it. He did 15 minutes at noon. And then in the afternoons, he would do a little snippet about 3.5 minutes long called The Rest of the Story. And Paul Harvey had a very peculiar way of speaking. Part of it was the old radio guy voice, where he would accentuate every syllable. And I think the voiceover artist Billy West calls it hamburger helper for words. So when Paul Harvey spoke, he spoke as radio intended, right? And there are things that he talked about, right? So he would accentuate everything, and it would kind of stretch out his delivery, but he would put a lot of pauses in there as well. And in the speeches that I give, I do pause a lot. And this is, it's very different from people who have been used to hearing from a high energy speaker, someone who is just going from point to point, whether it's Gary Vee or Peter Shankman, very high speed, high energy people. I get up there and I am I don't want to say breath of fresh air. I'm I'm different air. And when I make a point, a particularly salient point, I want to pause on it and let it sink in for people. And there are so many people who are afraid of silence that they feel like they have to fill every bit of airwaves. And when I know there are people out there listening to me on my podcast at 1.5 to 2 times speed, well, then the pauses actually help in that case. So part of it's dramatic effect. Part of it is again, understanding how you want to make a point. The other source that I really look to for thinking about writing for audio versus writing for the eye is NPR. If you listen to any NPR news stories, the sentences they use are short. They make their points without having to interject too much, right? So it's easy to follow along. When you're reading something, well, you can always go back and reread it if the sentence didn't make sense to you. But when you're listening, and particularly when you're listening live, if someone doesn't make the point that you expected them to in a particular cadence, then it becomes awkward for you to follow their point. So between Paul Harvey and his enunciation and pauses and NPR and their shorter sentences, I think you've got some interesting examples there that can help us differentiate between audio and visual writing.
So would you say that you're more Paul Harvey or more NPR or a blend of both?
Yes, probably both. You know, I think the Paul Harvey thing gets annoying, but I do appreciate storytelling. You know, and I've got a little podcast that I just started not too long ago to kind of break up the more lengthy interview shows that I do that are kind of like Paul Harvey's Rest of the Story.
Cool. That's cool. What's the name of the new podcast, Scott? Because I'm listening to Timeless and Timely. Is it in between there, or how do I find that?
It is. So you can find everything on timelesstimely.com, which is the Timeless and Timely network, so to speak. I've got the main newsletter that comes out every Tuesday. Excuse me. I've got the Timeless Leadership podcast that comes out every other Thursday. I've got the Off the Clock newsletter, which is for word nerds, that comes out every Saturday. And the opposite Thursday from the Timeless Leadership podcast, I've got Story Time. And there's probably like 115 podcasts out there in directories that are called Story Time. So I know it's not that original, but it's the best I could do.
Cool.
If somebody's got a better recommendation for me, let me know.
Yeah, send it in, right? Send in your cards and letters to P.O. Box 1. That's at Scott Monty. Where are you at now? Michigan, or where are you?
I am just outside of Ann Arbor, Michigan, Phil.
That's right. Cool. That's right. I knew that. So fantastic. So writing, creating a little bit different than creating the spoken word. So let's talk a little bit about those podcasts, Scott, because they seem very different to me, and yet likely I would bet that the audience, there's probably a lot of crossover, right? People that just want more Scott Monty.
God help those people. I feel sorry for them, quite frankly. My kids don't want more Scott Monty. They want less. Um, so here's the thing. I've always loved audio. I've loved working with microphones. I get I go to some of these literary clubs, and you get somebody up there who's holding a microphone like down at their waist, or they're talking like you're sitting right next to them. I'm like, you have to enunciate a little bit, right? So I'm always like half AV vice president and half media coach with these folks. I don't know. I've enjoyed music and soundtracks, and I like a lot of audio input, which is actually ironic because I'm losing my hearing, and I actually wear hearing aids on a regular basis. And one of my favorite composers, Beethoven, a guy who did half of his life's work without being able to hear what it is that he was producing, and he wrote some of the most beautiful music, right? So I understand the power of audio, the power of the spoken voice, the power of storytelling, which I think we need more of in all walks of life. This is how we relate to each other as humans.
Yeah, absolutely. More stories and I would argue less tweets, right? Because at 280 characters, it's tough to be nuanced. I mean, people have threads, but nonetheless, they almost have to be standalone thoughts at 280 characters, and it's hard to get any level of depth. Although I will say, I mean, a lot of the stuff you post, Scott, is much deeper than I would expect at 280 characters.
Well, here's the thing, Phil. I don't pretend to be profound by any stretch of the imagination. Certainly not on Twitter. I think it's very difficult to write short form. One of my favorite stories, and it may be apocryphal, but I like telling it this way nonetheless, is that Ernest Hemingway, whom I mentioned before, he dropped into the Algonquin Round Table. This was at the Algonquin Hotel in the 1920s, 1930s. All of the bon vivant writers were there. Dorothy Parker and Robert Benchley and Alexander Wolcott and a number of people. And they would mix it up from time to time. Hemingway dropped in there, and he put a $10 bill in the middle of the round table and said, I will bet $10. And if anybody else wants to get in on this bet, now's the time, that none of you can come up with a fully formed story in just 6 words. And they all put their $10 in. They said, even Hemingway, the master of the short form, can't possibly do a full story, beginning, middle, and end, in just 6 words. And they all put their $10 in, and he sat back and kind of put his hands up and thought for a minute. And then he said, for sale, baby shoes, never worn. Oh, man, that still gets me every time I hear that one. Then he collected all the 10s that were in the middle of the table there. You think about that. You think about, with those 6 short words, how much of a backstory there must be, and the pain and the angst and all the emotions that go through that. And Hemingway was able to pull it out in just 6 words. Now, that's a headline, really. Any good writer could take that and extrapolate upon it. But right there is the power of using short form if you know how to do it. And I'm sure Hemingway showed up prepared to do it. This whole thing was just a show. But if you're going to tweet, if you're going to put content out there, edit it. Editing and thinking through how you're going to say things. I got this in spades when we only had 140 characters. Back when I was a kid on Twitter, we only had 140 characters to deal with, and I was at Ford. And I had to do digital hand-to-hand combat with people and explain to them Ford's position on things in just 140 characters. Well, you needed to be creative with how you did that, because they wouldn't necessarily give you the courtesy of a follow-up tweet. They'd only read the first thing, right? So I think if we can get better at editing ourselves, and now we have threads, so that's great. But a lot of what I do in terms of my threads, they are short form from what I'm doing in my newsletter. It's a larger point that I'm trying to make. And if you want to read the full piece, great. If not, I'll have broken it down for you in 2 or 3 tweets to really give you the meat.
Wow. So you create this newsletter, you edit the heck out of it, then you edit it even more on Twitter. So how many rounds of editing, Scott, do you have in your creation process?
Not as many as I should, quite frankly. As a matter of fact, Phil, and I hate to admit this, I am late on today's newsletter. One of the things I tell people is to have a sense of predictability and a cadence around what you do. So I like to try and put mine out every Tuesday morning. Now, there's a lot of newsletters that go out on Tuesday morning, so I'm not feeling terribly about missing this morning's one, but it will go out before the end of the day. But the reason that it's late is because of yesterday's breaking news with Elon Musk and Twitter. I had a whole different topic planned. Well, not completely different, a related topic planned for this week. But as I am timely as well as timeless, I wanted to kind of focus on what was happening. And in the promise to my readers, I do need to find something that is historically or literally literature-based in terms of its relevance. So I was doing a little bit of research, and I'm still writing, if you can believe that, not editing. I will do a quick edit before it goes out, but this is one of those cases where you just have to be comfortable with your proficiency as a writer and know that what you put out, even though it didn't go through 2 or 3 rounds of edits, it's still going to make an impact.
So with all the noise and junk out there about what's going on with the purchase of Twitter, you still want to put your spin on that. Is that, I mean, I'm curious, is that because you feel you have something unique, or you're going to connect it in, or what's Scott's, without giving away the newsletter, I mean, what's the angle, Scott?
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly people can subscribe and follow up on it, but here's the angle. There have been instances of, well, not to put too fine a point on it, megalomaniacs who wanted to control the message in the past. I mean, look, Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post in 2013. And okay, so it's not a whole industry. He's not controlling the whole newspaper industry. It's one paper, just like Elon Musk is buying one social network. And did Jeff Bezos overrule and overpower the Post in terms of its editorial voice? No. And I think there's so many people jumping ship now, holding their nose at Elon Musk as the new owner. Well, he doesn't even own it yet. And people are already off today. They were already leaving in droves yesterday when the sale was announced. He still doesn't own it. The SEC has to approve it. It's still a public company, right? And they're already out of there. And I think that kind of a brain drain is actually going to hurt the social network rather than to help it. And a lot of people are saying, oh, I don't like Elon Musk's politics. I don't like how chaos-inducing he is. He's got no control over things. He's not going to moderate. And they're saying these things over on Facebook. And I'm like, you don't get the irony, do you? like Mark Zuckerberg is this giant humanitarian that you're now spending time with. So, there was that. I also had the exact same thought at the exact same time as Peter Shankman yesterday, when I saw that he said the richest man in the world trying to control how we communicate is literally the plot of Tomorrow Never Dies, the James Bond film. So I went and watched that last night to do some studying. And I think back to William Randolph Hearst, who in 1897, looking at the Spanish control of Cuba, cabled the artist Frederick Remington. And Remington said, there is no war down here. And he cabled back. He said, you provide the pictures, I'll provide the war. So, we've had these egomaniacs that have been trying to control the press, trying to control how we think for a long time. Even back to ancient Rome, going back to my classical studies history. Augustus, when he took over, he was the nephew of Julius Caesar, right? Julius Caesar came in as the dictator, ruled, was obviously assassinated. Octavian had to battle with Pompey and Mark Antony, eventually assuming the throne and the name Augustus and becoming an emperor, the first Roman emperor. And what did he do? He hired Virgil to write the Aeneid, which was Rome's answer to Homer's epic, Odyssey and Iliad. So Rome suddenly had an origin story, and it was propaganda. Why could Augustus get away with propaganda? Well, because he controlled the world. So, we've seen this story playing out over and over again. If you want to move society, if you want to change the way the public perceives different things, then control the presses.
Interesting. So we've got Washington Post owned by Bezos. We've got Twitter soon to be owned by Musk, and we've got Zuckerberg, Facebook, Instagram, and then where does that leave LinkedIn, TikTok, and maybe I don't know. There's some upstart I saw, Society or something. Did you see it? Or
no.
I don't know. I saw somebody every time anybody tweets about how they're leaving, I see that like in the third post after that, they're like, "But find me on whatever," right?
Yeah,
so
the usual plea.
Yeah, what do you think about all that?
People are going to go where they want to go, and they're going to go where their friends are. Quite frankly, this is the reason people didn't flee Facebook in droves. Well, what's your alternative at that point? The Twitter has really inhabited a very specific space in our modern culture. It doesn't necessarily define what happens, but it defines the news, right? It defines the coverage of what happens. Twitter is really a great instant microscope into so much of society. And the reality is most people are not on Twitter. With 300 million active users, and I don't even know if they're all that active. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say 200 million users. That's still a fraction of the world's population. And most people I know in my real life are not on Twitter, right? Marketing folks like you and I, communicators, journalists, obviously, entertainers, right? There are people here who go and talk about the things that actually are happening in the world and get amplified because then television picks up on tweets and puts them up on the screen for us to see. And that kind of symbiotic relationship between the media and Twitter, I think, is a very powerful one. But most people aren't living and dying by their Twitter feed.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's often overlooked. And yeah, to your point, we have an interesting echo chamber with us because, we see a lot of our marketing friends who are like, right, the sky is falling, we must get off. And not that Musk is or is not different than Zuckerberg or any of these folks, but we just don't know yet. I think it's just too soon to even make any sort of determination on what's going to happen. And to your point, 200 million, if that's worldwide, and that's a fairly small number of folks that are there, though admittedly a lot of news sources, every journalist, whether they started yesterday, probably every journalism student is on there. So how do we cut through that, Scott? How do we curate the good stuff like you do and make sure that it is that it's truthful? I think that's one thing I know I can count on you for. You actually do the work there to make sure that it's real. Though I always read what you share. I don't stress that, oh my gosh, Scott's full of crap here, he's got some agenda, even though I know where you lean, right? So how do you do that, man?
Well, look, everybody's got an agenda, and I won't disguise the fact that I do come from a particular direction, and quite frankly, the direction I'm coming from more recently is just, the last 5-6 years have just been ridiculous in terms of misinformation, disinformation, corruption, lack of ethics. And it's going to sound kind of hokey, but I come at it from kind of a truth, justice, and American way kind of perspective. For you Superman fans out there, you look at what's happening right now all across the country in various states, and I think there's a great concern for democracy. And to me, this isn't blue versus red, left versus right. This is about democracy and autocracy, which is a far bigger issue than any one political party. And to me, the forces that are behind autocracy and that are moving us in a certain direction, I mean, that's what's fueling my newsletter next week. I've actually got, where is it? A couple of books I've been reading. I had on vacation with me last week. I still didn't get to. One is, let me see if I can get it here, Tyrant by Stephen Greenblatt. He looks at Shakespeare on politics and how clever Shakespeare was in Richard III and Coriolanus and Macbeth and Lear and all sorts of other things. Because in Shakespeare's time, to speak out against the monarchy, to speak out against the government was treasonous. You could be executed for speaking out. Even if you were okay with the king, if you were critical in any way about what the king or queen was doing, that was it. So Shakespeare had to find a different way to have some sort of commentary on what he saw the human foibles in power were. The other book I've got is by Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, right? And there, again, there's a pattern afoot here. There's a recognizable pattern that we can see about how people, the public, are treated and how some of these political figures are coming through. And I think that in itself is extremely important for us to pay attention to. Now, you can agree with me or not, but to me, my role is kind of shining a light on this, helping people understand human nature, because understanding the past can help us predict more of what to expect in the future.
Yeah, they say that those who learn nothing from the past are condemned to repeat it, and I would tend to agree with that. I think so many have not studied any of that. So as a guy who has the time lists piece pretty lit, man. You've read more of the old classics than anybody I know, for sure, which is impressive. So how do you balance that with the need to be timely, Scott?
Well, what I do is I'm always, again, I have a lens on things. I look for the past and the present, and then I look for the present in the past. And if you can go into it thinking about that, okay, so Elon Musk bought Twitter. All right, well, that's the story of the world's richest man buying up a media entity. Who else do we know like that? And I mean, you can look to Bezos, and that's, from the past, all of 9 years ago. You can look at Rupert Murdoch, right? You could look at Succession, right? You look at that show on HBO. That's, again, more present than past. But again, look at William Randolph Hearst, look at Augustus. Trying to think through these things and understand, well, where have I seen something like this before? And now I haven't read everything, obviously. This is why I rely on, other sources, other people, different commentary. And I'm lucky that I simply had those examples in my back pocket. I have a whole list of things that I curate in OneNote, where I go, well, what's a leadership or communications characteristic that I think is going to be important? Let's talk about, I don't know, humility. Or let's talk about the power of silence, right? So when I've got those kind of bookmarked as topics that I want to cover, whenever I see something happening, whenever I come across something in my reading from the past, I try to take those and put them into those different slots and eventually fill in the gaps and write something halfway intelligent about them.
That's a good idea. I hadn't considered that, right? Think about starting with a topic and then putting things in OneNote based on that, so that then when it's time to write about that, you have that. That's super organized. So what other tools, Scott, do you have for curation or creation? I'd love to hear about some of those.
Yeah, and to me, curation itself is such an important habit because so many people are so busy, and we don't all have the same algorithms, the same feeds. We all see slightly different versions of what's going on, or perhaps completely different versions of what's going on. So for a curator, and there's a difference between simply amassing a lot of information and presenting it in a reasonable form. So it's the difference between a curator and an accumulator, right? Any collector will tell you that. I mean, you think about some of the books I've got behind me. For a while, I was simply an accumulator, and I had all the discernment of a vacuum cleaner. But when you refine your collection, when you refine your focus on whether it's your audience or your topic or whatever, you need to start curating. And for me, one of the tools I've used for a long time now is Flipboard. I have a number of magazines that I've created, and there's different categories. I have some for my Sherlock Holmes interest. I've got some for, the Timeless and Timely newsletter, etc. But the idea here is that I put things in there and put some comment. You know how when you go to whether it's a library or a museum exhibit, you'll see a wonderful display of objects, but there's always that little placard on the wall or under the glass case next to it, where the curator, literally the curator, has written up an explanation as to what it is you're looking at. Where it came from, what year it was painted. And that itself provides more context for you as the viewer, as the person taking in what's being curated. And for me, on Flipboard, that's what I've done, is I've put things in either in an order or with some additional commentary to help people make sense of it.
I like that. And I have noticed that about your Flipboard. I think that's so interesting, right? Because when bookmarking became a game, right? Because of Delicious and because of Stumble Upon and some of those, right? You remember those?
Yeah, so I do, and I used to use those. I remember those.
Well, we tried it. I think what happened, at least for me anyway, when Delicious integration with my blog ceased to work, because I would do what you do, right? I would curate the same way. A lot of my friends would say, because I love to read much like you do, although I would say I read probably more short form than long form. Although I guess lately I'm looking around my office. That's probably not true. I've probably got 400 books surrounding me here. They're probably going to swallow me soon. But, I think that once that stopped and people would game the system and use them for views to generate advertising revenue. I mean, that's the right. That is often the challenge, right? Is that whatever can be measured can be manipulated.
Right. Yeah.
And that's just like Twitter followers, right? I mean, I was reading earlier today, DeSantis gained 72,000 Twitter followers overnight.
Yeah.
Maybe, right? I say maybe because I didn't look at the stats, right? I'm not trying to, say anything politically about that, but I just think it's interesting how, is that him buying followers? Is that somebody buying followers for him to make him look bad? Is that just magical bots from Elon Musk's new bot farm? Or, I mean, what I mean? So I don't know, man.
I actually saw some stats on that just before we joined. Some 15,000 of those accounts were made in the last 24 hours. About 5,000 today, about 10,000 were just created yesterday. So you do the math and what that means,
Wow. That's interesting, right? So that changes curation. And I might say, right to your point, the curator matters as much as the curation.
It does. And this is why, it's so interesting with Musk and Twitter and him wanting to open it up to free speech. If you're running a community, even if you're running a public square, chaos does not comply with those aims. You can't have chaos and a public square. If you do that, you got a riot, right? If it kind of a Venn diagram, chaos, public square together, riot in the middle. You have to have some form of moderation. And I think that's what people want to a certain extent. I mean, there's a lot of people out there crying, censorship, this, that. Twitter is a public utility, whatever. Well, okay, then we need to treat it like a public utility and regulate it a little bit differently. Or we need to provide what any normal private business would do, a set of terms, conditions, guidelines, rules, expected behaviors, right? And ask people who, it's like if you go to somebody's house and they say, we don't wear our shoes indoors, would you mind terribly taking your shoes off? What do most people do? They take their shoes off. They do the respectful thing. And for Twitter to say, hey, please, no hate speech, no, attacking people, etc. These are our expectations. You don't want to live by them. There's the door. And a lot of people out there who are crying censorship and, lack of free speech they don't want the consequences of their action. They want free speech, but they want free speech free of consequences. And that's not how it works.
Yeah, it's sure not. And I think that the challenge for that is we need to make sure that that's equal and balanced on all behaviors, right? That all of that, anything that is too, I don't know, I guess too obscene or too whatever. And maybe that is the challenge, right? I mean, maybe each platform decides for themselves and people just accept that. I mean, I don't like hate speech. I don't think hate speech in any way should be permitted. That being said, right, that's a slippery slope.
Well, it is, because it's all open to interpretation. This is why Zuckerberg said they didn't want to get into the content moderation game. He didn't want to be the one deciding what's factual and what's not. Okay, well, if that's the case, then you need to be pretty clear about what's going to go on your platform as a result, and you need to own it. If you're not going to be a content moderator, if you're not going to ascribe value to the truth and devalue the lies, then you need to step up and realize what that means as a result.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Hey, I just want to shout out to Joel and Courtney, who have been commenting like crazy here. I didn't want you to think that we're ignoring you.
No, not at all. Not at all. So yeah, we got some good stuff there. Thank you very much for joining us today, Courtney and Joel. Yeah, good to see you both. So Scott, you've given us two tools here. You've given us OneNote. You gave us Flipboard. So any other cool tools or cool uses of tools that you're using?
I used to be a big tool guy back when I was like really into social media and digital. And I don't know, I've just become comfortable, I think, with so many of the tools that I do have. I think one of the others I've been playing with lately is Good Pods. I don't know if you've heard of them.
I've not.
It is a podcast discovery platform. It's more of a community. It's like podcasting meets community, where you can actually see what people are commenting on, what people are recommending. You can follow them, and you can get into different groups. Like I'm in the history group in Good Pods. So I think it's a really different and interesting way to think about podcast consumption and podcast discovery. The other, and this is just a fun one, it has nothing to do with curation, but it is audio related, and that is the new AMP app. I think AMP is now owned by Amazon, if I'm not mistaken. And what they do is they allow you to basically become your own DJ. And they have Amazon's catalog of music available, and you can put on your own shows for 10 minutes, an hour, whatever you want to do. I've been actually hosting a weekly program there called Music at the Movies, where I look at some kind of soundtrack, or I curate the music from like different disaster films, and come up with a 45-minute show on AMP there. So I think that's a lot of fun and allows people to express themselves through their own musical curation.
Wow. I'm not familiar with AMP. I found the URL on amp.com.
That's the one.
Yeah.
And if you want a code to follow, I think trying to think what I used to tell people to put in there. I'm going to pull it up on Twitter, see if I can find what I've said. Or if you just go to twitter.com/ I think _amp is there. No, that's not it. I'm doing this on the fly.
They're on AMP _.
On AMP. See, I knew there was an underscore in there. I think they may have a code word there that you can use to, and I can't even spell it while I'm on the fly here either. No, they don't have it there. Shoot. I think if you use the code on AMP, _. If you use the code go live, one word, go live, after you download the app, that will give you access to it.
Cool. So go live after you download the On Amp app. Say that 100 times fast,
Yeah,
right? So I'll
right.
pop that on screen for those watching
There
the
you go.
video, right? But for those not and listening, go live after you download onamp.com. It does appear that they do have as iPhone as well as, let's see, does it have an Android? I can't tell.
They're working on Android.
Okay,
as
so there you go.
usual, it's one of those lead with iPhone, follow with Android kind of thing.
There you
It's
go.
a developer's dilemma. I get it.
Mhm.
But they have said that they're doing Android, and I think they just rolled out a search function. It was very, very basic when I got on board. It was difficult to find people. I mean, you just popped it open and you just kind of thumb through and scrolled to see shows that interested you. So
The old way of discovery, Scott.
right,
Scrolling
like the
through
radio, where you just turn the dial and see what's on.
Yeah, that's fantastic, man. So cool.
And
So
shout out to our DJ in residence, Joel Ibava. Joel, great to know you were a
franchise
DJ,
king.
man.
Yeah, our buddy the
that's
franchise king. That's Joel. So yeah, that's cool. And right now, Midwest DJs Live is going on in Milwaukee, which is fun. So
that's fantastic.
Yep. Good groups of folks there. I've spoken to them a couple times, and really good people. So really cool. So all right, so Scott, so let's take us home, man. Folks, you can talk about creation, you can talk about curation, or you can just talk about being timeless and timely. Give us a tip on how to get started in one of those.
Look, you need to find the thing that makes you interested in learning more, right? Because I think that is the ultimate, whether it's leadership or marketer or communicator based advice, is be curious. And if you're not curious, I can't help you. I mean, Dorothy Parker said curiosity is the cure for boredom, right? Which is great. I mean, if you're curious, you are never bored because you're always searching for something. But she followed it up by saying, there is no cure for curiosity. Right. So that's the great curse, that the search never ends, but be a sponge, be curious about something. I don't care what it is. If it's about, collecting bottle caps, or if it's about diversity and inclusion, or whatever it is that really gets you going, be really curious and passionate about that, because that is what is going to make you interested in the topic and learning more and becoming an expert on it. And it is also what is going to make you interesting to other people. It's going to be what sets you apart from other folks. And I guarantee you, Phil, that there is nobody out there like me who was a classics major and the head of social media at a big brand, and who has a fountain pen collection, and who wears bow ties and loves Beethoven. I mean, maybe, but I don't think you're going to have him on the show. You probably shouldn't have had this one on the show.
Oh, that's not true, Scott. You're always a treat, my friend. Scott Monty, you're amazing, dude. So let me wrap up here the good stuff you shared. You led off with Führer Scribendi and Dan Pizanski, which is really fun. You said leadership is all about communication. You don't need to write because writing sounds like how you speak. Talked about Paul Harvey and NPR, the dichotomy, if you will, of communication, timeless and timely. All things timeless and timelesstimely.com is all things that you write about, and then bringing it home with commentary creates context, and be curious because there's no cure. So great stuff, Scott, as always. I love Timeless and Timely. Your newsletter is great. I enjoy your podcast, and I always enjoy you. You're one of my favorite followers on Twitter at Scott Monty. So great stuff, dude. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Phil. It's good to be with you always, and it's always wonderful to see your 1,000,000-watt smile.
Oh, thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. And thanks, Joel and Courtney, and everybody else for listening. Whether you chimed in or not, I hope you find some timeless and timely in your day. Have a great day. Thanks so much.